Thank you very much. You're all very welcome here. We're delighted to see such a great turnout. Georgina and I are both co-directors of the MPhil in Public History and Cultural Heritage here at Trinity College Dublin. It's a 6-year-old programme, and I suppose public history is about 6 years old in Trinity itself as a sort of an academic discipline. So our goal in this presentation, it's going to be a 25-30 minute presentation, is to just bring out some of the major concepts of public history, and then to survey some of the work that's been going on in Ireland over the last 12 months or so, and just drawing out some examples of what we consider to be really good collaborative practice between publics and between academics and other actors or stakeholders, I hate that word, in history more generally, and also some ones that aren't so good, and just to kind of, in a sense, spark off some debates that we hope will run through the next day or so in all of your work. So, without any further ado, here is the structure of what we're going to talk about. We're going to try and define what we mean by public history. Then we're going to talk about this concept, which belongs really to Michael Frisch, sharing authority. And then we're going to look at some practical examples over more or less 2016 up to about the present in this particular country and in this particular context. And then we're going to open the floor for questions, as I say, after about half an hour. Georgina and I will compete for your attention here in a sort of a slightly awkward way over the next while. So, what do we mean by public history? I suppose, and this is just, I'm showcasing some of the work from the Public History Masters here as we go along as imagery. There are several competing definitions, and like any good academic discipline, nobody really knows what it is, and everybody refuses to define it adequately or definitively. Here's an early one, an early definition from 1978, Robert Kelly, one of the more famous ones. Public history refers to the employment of historians and historical method outside of academia. So at its beginning as an academic discipline, public history was something that conceived of itself as something that was defiantly outside of the academy. It was about history as practiced with or to the public that did not involve academic history, which was seen as something that was inward-looking, navel-gazing, and just not part of that process at all. And since then, I think the definition of public history has widened considerably and much more to include professional practitioners and good old-fashioned academic historians, which I suppose both Georgina and I would claim to be. Here's a more recent one from 2006. This is Shelley Buckspan. Public historians, like entrepreneurs, must be collaborators. A public historian curating a museum exhibit must collaborate with designers, donors, other historians, boards of directors, interpreters, and audiences. So again, this absolute sense of the discipline having moved back inside the academy, also circulating through the major institutions, our national museums, and so on. And all of a sudden, it's not somehow outside the fold anymore. Public history is much more at the center of what we do within academic practice. And that's much more closer to a definition, I think, that we would subscribe to. So broadly speaking, it has a spatial sort of root as well. Public history is a term that emerges in the United States in the 1970s, and really you see it spread across the former colonies of the UK. I don't know whether that's coincidental or not. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, and only latterly, really in the last 10 years, we've seen it come through in a European context. The International Federation for Public History is just 3 years old, which will give you some sense of where it is as a discipline. It has, I would say, at least 3 distinguishing features, though we'll talk about this a lot more over the coming day or so. Number one, I would say public history is present-centered. It's about usable pasts. It's an instrumental, in some senses, approach to history. Working under the presupposition that the public in general will be animated by certain things that have cultural contemporary resonance, pop cultural resonance. They're not going to be as easily animated by 16th century French pamphlets as they are by something much more modern, and so on, something that will grab attention, a revolutionary history, a conflict-based history. So this idea that we're interested in usable pasts and also constructions of pasts with the public that can be put to some purpose, sometimes nefarious, sometimes positive. Okay. Secondly, it's collaborative by nature. So public history has to be collaborative. You have to work with people, if possible, not just academic historians, not just students and so on, people who are implicated in the field. It must also involve preferably a lot of people who can contribute to it. And thirdly, as a result of that, it's something that's also aimed at wide non-academic audiences. So something that within the projects that all of you are here to talk about over the next day or so. I mean, most of you are very skillful practitioners in this already. It's about managing to find a public for your work, managing to find and then expand that public by definition. Okay, so again, those are just sort of central ideas in the field as it has grown over the last 30 or 40 years. But what about this concept that we want to root our analysis in for the next day or so, sharing authority?
So the baton has been handed over. I'm going to speak a little bit about sharing authority, and I thought the best way to do it was through a very basic example, and that's through our preparation for this talk. So it's not normal or certainly usual that two colleagues and two academics present in this way. It tends to be the exception rather than the rule. So in terms of the distinction between sharing authority or shared authority, I thought would be a good way of kind of fleshing out the distinction between the two. So sharing authority, and these two concepts are distinguished by Michael Frisch, and we have some talk about that in a few minutes later. But the implication would be that Ciaran is sharing his authority with me. And why is that? And why does he have the authority? Well, it's not because he's male. It's because he's a little longer in the field than I am. He has professional expertise and experience. I came onto the course 2 years ago. He's been here since 2011. He's also given a paper recently on sharing authority in relation to artists and galleries and commemoration. So in terms of that, then, his sharing authority, would that imply that he had the final decision-making authority over what goes into this presentation, what gets cut, whose ideas dominate and what gets excluded, and how the presentation is structured? And this suggests a slightly unequal power relationship, but that's not what happened. We have shared authority more, so it's been much more of an equal experience in terms of the creation of this presentation and its delivery. And that requires a couple of things. Number one is collaboration, which Ciaran has already talked about. It also requires trust that two people's different opinions and expertise will actually be heard in a very equal and fair way, and that both sets of ideas will be presented here for you, and that you as the audience will get something slightly different out of it from you. One person might favour ideas that Ciaran's speaking about, somebody else might favour mine, or that something in your head will click and you'll see something that we haven't seen, a link or a connection. So basically, in collaborating with each other on a practical and an intellectual level, we can kind of do that much more easily with a public audience. So I think that's one of the benefits of sharing authority and working on public history, is that you're learning to collaborate all of the time. And this makes the actual public-facing aspect of public history a little easier to contemplate, particularly for academic historians who tend to work with an archive which doesn't talk back to you, thankfully. And so from that point of view, we're used to making a decision about what to exclude. And no matter how true to the archive you want to be, the power always ultimately rests with the historian. We decide what to exclude, even if we're being faithful to the overall sense of the archive. So from that point of view, then, something that's much more collaborative and with working with people who talk back and engage with each other, you're getting a very different sense of the kind of history that can be produced. And that's the kind of experiences that you all probably have working with various different groups and projects that you've worked on as well over the course of your own careers. So we have a couple of case studies of how authority is created. So Ciaran is going to speak, I think, about the first.
Yeah, one of the things when we were prepping this talk was that we were really both interested in the construction of the authoritative historian. So we're both historians, so we know that historians are fallible, first of all, sometimes very prone to sort of a control freakery, sort of, in a sense, the way they go about their bases. We know all the flaws that come along with being an academic historian, but there's a sense within a public construction that there is a figure, the historian. The historian is somebody that has a sort of cultural resonance, a power in popular culture. And it's no surprise that some of our more influential political commentators in both these islands are historians, or people who are trained as historians. The power of the sort of so-called Telly-Don to help influence public opinion is maybe greater proportionately than we even see with sociologists or political scientists or so on. People that have I suppose, a power to speak within our society. And we're interested, because we're historians, in deconstructing that a little bit. So we thought we'd begin with an image of what I think classically we have in mind when we think of a historian. So this is the historian Romila Thapar at her desk in New Delhi, a very famous Indian historian. But look at the construction of the image.
The slide is in. Oh, sorry, yeah.
So here we are, a lone figure, very important, no collaboration, surrounded by an absolute vast archive of knowledge, which you presuppose are books that the historian has read, which is, of course, absolutely not the case. Right? But it's there, nonetheless, to intimidate undergraduates and visitors into your office, because they don't know you haven't. Books strewn around the table, again, very plush, very elite sort of background. And for anybody who's ever appeared in a history documentary, as both Georgina and I have both had the misfortune of doing, you'll understand that the construction is very deliberate. They'll either sit you down in sort of mahogany, backlit, soft lighting, glass of whiskey in front of you, and you're a sort of talking head that, you know, knows everything, and you're super confident, and you say, well, that wasn't the way this happened, this is the way it happened. This is all just a sort of very well-rehearsed kind of script, in a sense. Or else my favourite one, where you go and you look at a sort of series of papers. Really, you're really overcome by emotion at these papers, and you've never seen these papers before. These are remarkable papers. And of course, you've been standing there doing this take for about an hour, and you realize the whole thing is absolutely a construction of, okay, discovery and journey and knowledge and so on. So in a sense, this is what's always happening, whether it's a sort of a profile picture or a documentary setup or whatever else. That authority is invested by the camera or by the person looking at it in this individual. And it is, of course, a construct. And it's interesting when you flip that and you think about who can disrupt that type of construction, or what's the type of event that can unsettle or destabilize that the authority of the historian. So we picked one example, which is Irish, but very recent, and many of you will be aware of it, and Georgina will speak to it now.
So this is a very different image. This is Catherine Corliss, who's known in media in Ireland as local historian, amateur historian, various different terminologies that clearly distinguish her as not a professional historian, not an academic historian. And there she's sitting at the kitchen table with papers strewn all over. It looks vaguely disorganised. She's having a cup of tea, and she's also probably, you know, maybe doing a bit of history in between making the dinner. You know, and she actually has been referred to as a kitchen table historian by one noted RTE journalist. But Catherine Corliss has broken one of the biggest stories in Irish 20th century history in the last number of years. She's responsible for highlighting the fact that 796 babies were found in the, or were thought to be buried in the Tuam mother and baby home. And this broke in 2014. What's interesting about this is only in the last week has it been 100% confirmed that Professor James Smith, who is an English literary scholar from Boston College, actually informed the McAleese report about the 50% mortality rate among the babies in the mother and baby home in 2012, and it was excluded from the report. So there's a couple of things going on here. I mean, the way that Catherine Corliss kind of did her work was very painstaking. She went through all of the death records for the mother and baby homes for the period from the 1920s to the 1960s. She discovered almost 800 children, and through that then was able to reconstruct and through maps be able to kind of identify and locate those bodies, and that's now been verified by the government inquiry and the Commission of Investigation. But what's interesting here is I think that the type of skills that she's acquired, maybe through doing local history, through doing genealogy and family history, equipped her to create and construct and investigate this very, very significant story of institutional mismanagement and neglect and possible criminality. We don't know yet. But yet James Smith, who went through all the official channels in 2012 and made a very academically referenced submission to the McAleese report, was completely ignored. So what does that tell you about who actually can bring meaning to and who can actually reveal something really important and significant about our past, and what that tells us about the role of the historian and the English scholar or the professional academic, but also the role of the kitchen table historian. And it's not a comparison about who's more important than the other. It's about working together where we can, but there is there is a place for the kitchen table historian that's extremely important, and the work of Catherine Corliss and other people who are probably doing this around the country is testifying to that and kind of advocating for that.
So with those kind of complexities in mind, let's move to Michael Frisch's term sharing authority, which has sort of given us a conceptual hook for this meeting. So Michael Frisch has published a series of works on this, which some of you may be very aware of and some of you may not. This is taken from a 1990 book, A Shared Authority, Essays on the Craft and Meaning of Oral and Public History. It's kind of a foundational book, I would say, within the field. And Frisch distinguishes between sharing authority and a shared authority. It's kind of a later development of the same theory in a sense. The former, sharing authority, implying that a historian has authority, so someone obviously like me or Georgina within the academy broadly defined, and have a duty to share that expertise with a wide public. So as part of our job, we would amplify and disseminate our research work to as wide an audience as possible, something that I think most historians generally try to do anyway. And the term a shared authority, as in kind of a post facto one, applies when a traditional historical authority and the public share both in the interpretive and the meaning making process by definition. That is to say, a sort of co-design and co-research approach to a public humanities or public history project. So that right from the foundation of the design of the project, you are including a public in it on the expectation that that will add something rather than detract it. And that the design process will be different because of that, because you don't have full control of it anymore. And as I just said, most historians I know absolutely hate relinquishing any control at all. So in a sense, Frisch's concept strikes at the heart of the practice of academic history, where we design our work very rigidly and we produce it, and then at the other end of the process generally try to disseminate a perfect or flawless or certainly defensively written thing. Linda Shopes had something to add to that.
Yeah, so the quote here, this resonant phrase neatly captures that which lies at the heart of both the method and the ethic, or perhaps one should say the politics of the oral history enterprise. The dialogue that defines the interview process itself and the potential for this dialogue to extend outward. So the idea that in an oral history interview, the interviewer and the interviewee are both doing their absolute best to understand the position of the interviewee. So it's a continuous process and it doesn't just end with the interview. This happens in public forums, radio programs, dramatic productions, publications and other forms towards a more broadly democratic cultural practice. And this kind of democratizing of research is very much reflects what I was talking about early on in terms of the type of skills that who do you think you are, and the Irish, all the various genealogical ancestry, find my past, all of these massive digital tools that are available online for a big or small price depending on your wage, that they facilitate this sort of thing. So anybody can become a kind of a practicing historian in a way, but it's about then the degrees of where you take that, who you're collaborating with, and the kind of uses that it's put to in the public field.
And it's worth saying, I think, that this is not just a sort of obviously or uniquely positive outcome. Of course, one of the problems of losing control and sharing authority is that you lose control of the project and where it might go, and you might not like where it ends up as a practicing historian. It might not be the type of project that you would have done solo or that you would be willing to sign off on in the first place. I suppose that's one thing to remember. We tend to talk, I think, within public history about this as being the way to go always with public-facing projects, but it's not necessarily the case. And there are lots of examples of projects that can spiral out of control because of this sort of loose management of hierarchies and control, I suppose. So just to sound a warning, if you like. So we thought we'd cycle through a couple of examples, practical, real-world examples of what has happened over the last year or so within what I suppose is the most important commemorative year within the Republic of Ireland, certainly since 1966, 2016, the year in which we revived, replayed, reimagined, and so on. I sound like the brochures now. Our revolutionary past from 1916, the seminal moment within certainly an Irish nationalist construction of history. So I began with this image here, which is Garrod O'Dee's very public mural in the city centre of Dublin. You might, I hope, be able to see that reasonably well. It's an image of a sort of a trinity of women over the Irish flag, and the reason I pick this image is because for me it very neatly sums up some of the approaches that were taken within kind of outward-facing public history, especially that which came from state sources over the past year. And that the revolutionary past of Ireland was somewhat feminised, but was also a reinscription of the primacy of the flag, the tricolour. This public-facing mural contains the official message within it, which is really interesting to me because it comes from an artist that wasn't commissioned from state money. So what do I mean? I want to make a distinction here between the types of commemoration I'm going to track very quickly in a number of slides, between what I would call formal or didactic commemoration practice, as in that which was paid for by the government, that was received by a largely passive public, and that contained a very definite message, in my opinion, which I'd love to talk to about with you later. And that I would see as being, in essence, about not sharing authority, very deliberately constructing an inaccessible message that was already preordained. And then I want to look at some, I suppose, more community-based approaches and more artistic-based approaches where a public or a group of artistic practitioners were brought in and given freedom and autonomy to create whatever response to the revolutionary period that they wanted to imagine, which in some sense is a much more positive way of commemorating where there's much less control over message. And then we want to look at just one example. There are many of things that as professional historians we would have said, okay, that's problematic over the past year. That's something that we wouldn't be comfortable with as a sort of element of public history. And all by way of kind of sparking up questions from you guys in a minute. So I'll be as quick as I can. Okay, so formal, top-down, didactic forms of commemoration. So the official commemoration launch was in 2015 by Minister Heather Humphreys. And you can see that there's a kind of all bells and whistles sort of glitzy approach. Those of you who are resident in the Republic of Ireland will have been drowning in this message, which looks like this: remembering, reflecting, and reimagining. So a program that was built around 3 key principles. It had 7 subsections, which were rolled out from a central launch coming out of a 2-year, I suppose, I wouldn't call it a think tank, but certainly a sort of a perishable state body that was in charge of commemorations, which rolled out a 7-arm program and then rolled it down to the county councils and so on in a sort of an outward centralised way, which put a primacy on artistic collaboration, I think was one of the most positive things, but also had several key embedded messages, which I want to talk about in a non-conspiratorial way. This is what the Easter Parade 2016 looked like. Now, very impressive thing. How many of you attended this out of interest? Okay. Not that many. Interesting. I went along. Did you go?
No.
Okay. It was important, I think, in some senses, just to witness how passive the crowd. You're a passive recipient of a message when you're in a parade like this, looking at quite a military. I don't conceive of our society as a highly militaristic one, but the message was militaristic on the day of the Easter Parade. And here we had a very well choreographed, very messaged, but very passive event, I would say. Same thing at Glasnevin. I'm not having a go at Georgina's 50% employers, but again, a simple idea here, a passive recipient. We have the state, we have the army, we have solemnity, surrounded by flowers and so on, and we must all be very grave. And you can see this image, I think, is wonderful because you have the heads of the churches, the heads of the state, the heads of the military, all there, front row, just like 1966, really no different. State commemoration, highly conservative in 2016 in most of its forms. And then perhaps for me most troubling of all, although this I'm willing to admit is somewhat of a personal crusade, the presence of the army really is one of the absolute key aspects of commemoration through 2016. The national flag delivered to every primary school in the country, barring 2 who objected, just 2, and handed over to children and teachers. So a direct sort of presence of the military connecting itself to our revolutionary past and presenting itself through our education system to our children, which is remarkable because, of course, the Irish Army doesn't have a direct connection to 1916. It's worth remembering that in the South. Something that wasn't really commented on much at the time. But again, just shows you how formal in some senses the commemorative program was. All in all, now that I've been hypercritical, I would say there are positive things about that top-down didactic approach. We can say that the 2016 commemoration platform within Ireland had some distinguishing features, probably these. A widespread diversification of the definition of what a 1916 participant could be. That is to say, incorporating for the first time in a broad sense women, children, and non-participants, non-combatants, I suppose. 2, it was distinctly personal and immersive in tone. So there was a personal note struck, and again, one that maybe arguably was allowed by 100 years distance. And 3, it was forward-looking. So it was also about how this process could heal us as a country, prove that we're mature, and then launch us out into the future. So again, these are all positive elements, I would say, arguably, and to some extent summed up by the state-sponsored Rebellion mini-series of highly controversial one in some senses, but one that captured all of this official message at its heart, a feminized approach to the display of the original events, but one that was also kind of top-down and highly centralized in its message. Here's a tweet from Colin Tobin, which I liked at the time, which was a comment on the negative reaction to this 6 million mini-series. Okay, best practice, very quickly. Here are some projects that we really admired, an inexhaustive list because of time pressure. So, first one, Women of 1916.
Yeah, the first one was based at Richmond Barracks, and we have Catherine Neville here from Richmond Barracks, who, if you would like to talk more or learn more about this, she would be well placed to tell you about it. But basically, it was marrying 77 women from today, with 77 women who were incarcerated in Richmond Barracks, or who were arrested and held in Richmond Barracks. And through researching, along with professional historians, the history of these individual women, and creating a very large panelled quilt, which can be seen if you visit Richmond Barracks and Golden Bridge. And there was also collaboration with the Ciaran school as well. So it was actually women of today engaging directly with an individual woman from 1916. And in that respect, they produced something very... it's a female product in that it's quilt, it's sewing, it could be seen in some ways as being very gendered, but at the same time it is a very powerful kind of artifact that was produced out of the 2016 commemorations. And there's direct dialogue, and there's a small number of people involved, but its resonance and its the methods by which they did, I think, were extremely positive. It was really well done.
So from a very focused collaborative approach here, which had a creative output, we moved to Letters in 1916, maybe one of the flagship collaborative, crowd-funded, if you like, crowd-sourced projects of 2016. Began in 2014. Its goal was to allow people to be involved in the transcription process and also the submission of letters from the year 1916. And if they pertained to 1916 itself, so much the better. But again, a very broad sweep. It was absolutely open to a wider public, involved a huge amount of outreach work in focused working groups, and was really a sort of model project, I suppose, of a sort of crowdsourced history. Moved between Maynooth and Trinity with its PI, Susan Schreibman, who now works at Maynooth. Some very quickly, because I'm running out of time, artistic approaches that really impressed us during the year. Anu Productions, a site-specific theatre company, very experimental, very avant-garde, very popular. These things are all possible. Produced These Rooms, a site-specific piece of theatre in Dorset Street, as Dubliners insist on saying. An amazing event, site-specific theatre, a different pathway almost for every participant, small groups of people running through a house, and really, really spectacular, I think, in terms of its reviews. Equally, at Lismore Castle, the Museum of August Destiny, this curated by another very gifted academic, Emily Mark Fitzgerald of UCD, modelled on a personal museum again, so inviting artists to respond creatively. I suppose, again, a highly focused way of dealing with members of the not exactly ordinary public, but nevertheless something that was collaborative and gave freedom of interpretation in relation to events. A really smart, very well executed exhibition. And lastly, this turned up just during the week when we were looking at aspects of community public history events that maybe were just the wrong side of what we would call general principles of public history. And this is from Georgina's neck of the woods, so I'll let her explain it.
This is from the Bumboy Workhouse, and this actually isn't the Bumboy Workhouse, but just to give you a bit of a sense, there are over 160 workhouses in Ireland. There are about 4 or 5 of them currently being rejuvenated and kind of brought back into use as community centres and heritage centres across different parts of the country, and it's largely done by the community seeking government support and government finances. So it's all driven by community groups and community networks. But Bumboy Workhouse last week, I think it was the 12th of May, had a commemoration outside the newly regenerated Bumboy Workhouse, which is a very small part, very rural part of the world in West Cavan, kind of on the border with Leitrim. And the school was involved, local TDs were involved, and it gives you a little bit of a sense of the community involvement that was done here. And so far, so good. It all looks perfectly acceptable, I think. And you have the Irish Army present again, omnipresent. The Army were actually invited, and they had a remit last year and this year to respond to 1 or 2 requests from each county to be involved in commemoration. And they had a budget for this as well. So they were brought down to Bumboy, they raised the flag, of which we don't have a photograph. And then, don't know exactly how this came about. There was obviously some sort of reenactment. And this is what I came across last week, which kind of shocked me a little bit.
A reference to the execution of the 1916 martyrs, but it gets worse from here.
Yeah. So you have here young school children all dressed in black as if they're pallbearers or going to a funeral, blindfolded, and the next image shows them dead.
Yeah, amazing.
But the young boy sitting is actually a reference to James Connolly, who was shot in his seat. So I found that shocking, and I thought about it, and I was like, and I said it to a friend of mine last night. I was telling her I was giving this talk, and we were going to present this very startling, what I thought was kind of a startling image, and she was like, "That's a great idea." I was like, really? I wasn't sure. And then you kind of think about it, and you think, well, actually, it's young men. It's shocking. They did die, and it brings the reality of their very young deaths to our doorstep, and it gives an emotional reaction. But it's probably something most academic historians probably, well, I'm uncomfortable with it, I think.
I'd be driving down the hill behind the day, yeah, the minute I saw that.
But, I mean, it's how communities have chosen to reflect on this. And it would be kind of a nationalist Republican area, I suppose, as well.
But is it even that different from, some of the state formal ceremonies in terms of its tone and execution? It's militarized. We have our local dignitaries. We have our local politicians. We have the education system involved in it. So in actual fact, what I thought was really amazing about this was that it had all of the core ingredients of the state official commemoration absolutely percolated down to about as community as it gets in rural Cavan, Leitrim border. So yeah, we thought we'd end our conversation about shared authority with this image. I'll take this image off now. Okay, and nobody was harmed as far as I'm aware. So we're very happy to take any questions on any of that.